In our earlier sessions on revelation and faith, we prepared the grounds for an understanding of the workings of theology, how we carry out the task of theology. A very much quoted definition of theology is faith seeking understanding. That's from St. Anselm in the 12th century. Faith seeking understanding. If you think about it, we're all theologians. We're all seeking to understand our faith. So you've got informal theology that all Christians are involved in as they reflect on their faith and interpret it for themselves. And then you've got a more formal theology. That's what we want to discuss in this session. Now note that theology is a work of faith. Faith seeking understanding. All the great theologians who left their mark on the life of the church made a big contribution of being people of deep faith. Their faith wanted to find deep understanding, and they turned to whatever resources they could find to make that interpretation. In the modern times, when Christian faith has been challenged by many people, secularists and those who think we've grown out of religion, there's a temptation on the part of some theologians to try to make our Christian message conform to the expectations of the fashions of thought of our own time. That's called liberal theology. It's pretty widespread among non-Catholic theologians, and even sometimes Catholic theologians are tempted to go down that path. John Henry Newman, the great English convert, cardinal, was very aware of this danger and spoke very strongly against it. The faith is unchanging. The faith must not be compromised, and we must never be afraid of interpreting the faith and all its demands, all it affirms, the magnificent truths that it gives us, and not compromise those truths. The task of theology is a complex one. And remember, if it's really a work of faith, when you're doing theology, bring the inspiration, the enthusiasm, the wonder that you've had as you reflect on revelation and the nature of faith itself. But what we've seen about revelation and faith shows us that the task of theology is complex. In fact, we can describe the work of theology as going through three phases. First of all, there's positive theology. Theology that determines the data that a theologian has to work with. It has to interpret the scriptures, that complex literature we've spoken of. We'll come back to that. Then it has also to interpret the living faith of the church down through the ages. The Saviour said, "I'll be with you always, even to the end of time. My words will not pass away." The faith given to the church will always be there. And therefore, the living faith of the church is a witness. It's an index theologians use to understand the continuity and unity of our Christian faith. So that study of Christian thought down through the ages concerns faith at the level of popular life, the grassroots level of the faith, very important. The faith lives in the church. And then there's the interpretations made by theologians in different ages. So that must be studied. And then there is the authoritative guidance of the church's authority. The church has an authority that safeguards this living faith and gives guidance to people in times of uncertainty or doubt about the faith. So these teachings of the church also are very important for the theologian. So that's the work of positive theology, the first phase, getting the data together. Then what we call systematic theology. All that we've learned about the living faith of the church then is systematized by thinkers. They recognise the advances that have been made, the achievements that have been made. They reflect on how this can be put together. They formulate an inspiring vision for the church of their time and speak to the church of their time. That's systematic theology. It's an enormous task, and you can imagine how rich it is. People in different cultures, different backgrounds, making their interpretation, helping their own age and people to understand the faith. And then the final phase of theology is pastoral theology. How do we hand on the faith? We've seen that faith brings with it a responsibility to share in God's own ongoing message to his people, an encouragement for his people. So how do we hand that on? Pastoral theology reflects on the ways in which the faith can be communicated to young and to old, how the faith can be taken to cultures and peoples who have not heard the Christian message or haven't heard it in its fullness, how the faith can be brought to people of our own age who are uncertain and threatened by the fashions of the time. All this is pastoral theology that discusses the ways in which the mission of the church can be carried forward. Now those three phases, you'll notice, have different methodologies. Positive theology uses all the skills that have been developed in interpreting literary traditions. To understand the Bible, it's a literature, as we said. We've got to interpret how that literature was formed. So that's critical awareness. Great skills have been developed by scholars in modern times of making this interpretation, and that's brought to the work of interpreting the biblical material, then interpreting the thought of the church down through the ages. Then systematic theology. Its primary instrument has been the resource of philosophy, clarified thought, disciplined thought. How do we understand the great truths of faith in a way that is disciplined, responsible, balanced, and meaningful for people? That's the work of systematic theologians, and they use the richness of human thought in all its forms, particularly philosophy, and the history of ideas, the way in which thought does progress down through the ages. Then in pastoral theology, in modern times, the advances in psychology, understanding how people develop, how their thought develops, how they mature, the understanding of social patterns, the handing on of ideas in society, and social thought, cultural differences. All of these things we have a far more informed understanding of today, and they must be brought to the work of theology as it reflects on how the faith can be interpreted, how it can be handed on. Let's now look at positive theology in its many forms. First of all, the most basic work of positive theology is interpreting the biblical material, interpreting that literature. To do this, scholars have to identify the real text. All the texts we have that have been copied down through the centuries have been copied many times, and there are mistakes in them. So there's a whole skill in identifying what the original text was from these variant texts. That's textual criticism. That's the first phase, obviously, a preparatory phase. Then comes the work of interpreting that literature once we've got the text before us. So important here is literary criticism. In modern times, historical methods have been greatly improved and sharpened. It's possible now to identify all writings of the Bible in their original context. So see how important that is. When you're writing in a context, you're thinking of the problems that people are facing. So when we know those problems of the different situations, it helps us very much to interpret what the intention of the author was. What are the questions he's answering? What are the problems he's facing? What's the answer that he gives to those problems? And then you have the question of the literary forms used by the author. If you don't know the literary form, you can go widely astray in interpreting a text. Many literary forms are used in the Bible, literary forms that reflect the fashions of literature down through the ages in many cultures. I'll give you a very clear example. The book of Jonah is a very late writing in the Old Testament. It's really a moral story. There may have been a prophet named Jonah that provides sort of the person to tell the story about, but it's a made-up story. Jonah gets the sulks because God is good to Nineveh, the great pagan city. The author is making fun of the Jews who think that outside their benefit and their relationship with God, the other people are lost and have no hope. The book makes fun of Jonah. He gets the sulks, he sits under a castor oil tree, God sends a grub to kill the tree, and even the son that he had in the desert is gone. So when people thought there was a real prophet named Jonah, they spent a lot of time trying to work out how a whale or a large fish could have swallowed this man. Now we know it's just a fanciful story to make a moral. See how important it is if you know the literary form, namely this is fiction, but a moral story, a very important lesson in it, very close to the gospel really, leading us to the thresholds of the gospel, the openness of God to all the peoples of the world. If we don't know the literary form, well, we can go widely astray. So great advances have been made in that. I mentioned when we were speaking of the scriptures that very often material has been handed down and reused. So now scholars can identify certain forms of stories that have been handed down and take on a very distinct form in that process, and they're finally then used by some later author. I'll give you a very simple example, a very telling one. The miracle stories of Jesus have a particular form. And when you reflect upon it, it's quite in contrast with wonder stories, but that is not the way the story to Jesus' miracles are told. Jesus is reluctant to have people running around enthusiastic about the wonder. Because, as we said, those miracles are a sign of God's coming. And if people don't open the heart to recognize that and to accept Jesus as the one who's bringing the message of a healing and wonderful, generous God, they get carried away with the wonder and miss the point. So clearly, when you analyze these miracle stories, they've taken a particular form that point to the authenticity of the original event. Really confirms our faith in Jesus and our acceptance of Jesus as a wonder worker. The evidence is pretty clear. So that's form criticism. And then there's what we call redaction criticism, editorial criticism. People who've used material from previously developed and previously used, as they use that material, they edit it. They situate what they have to say. They might even change some of the circumstances, some of the details, to bring out something more clearly for themselves or for their listeners. The four Gospels are editing material that has been used before, handed down before. And when we understand that, we begin to understand the concern of the one who puts that Gospel together. Probably Mark was the first to do it. A lot of stories that he received from teachers and the stories about Jesus that were widespread among the first Christians. Mark gathers them all together. He emphasizes the crucified Lord. He's more than a wonder worker. He's the crucified Lord and calls us to be his disciples. Luke the convert, pagan convert, Greek convert, probably a doctor who was converted to the faith. He emphasizes the joy of believing. He emphasizes the Holy Spirit work in the church. He emphasizes the place of women in the church's life. Give us something of the spirit of Luke as he uses the material that he derives from Mark and from other sources. Or Matthew's Gospel, written for a Jewish community of converts. People have been converted to the faith, but now they're in conflict with their old Jewish associates. So Matthew is emphasizing all the things that Jesus said that can be used in answering their pagan critics. Letter to the Hebrews is a similar writing. It's written for Jewish people who are nostalgic. They become Christians, but it's all so simple. There's all the magnificence of the temple and the worship and the liturgy of their old temples gone, and they're tempted to go back. But he says, don't go back. The whole message is that they're only shadows. Now the reality has come. All those things only foreshadow the magnificent things we now believe in our Christian faith. It's clear, I think, that for you that historical awareness has greatly improved our access to the material of the scriptural tradition. That awareness raises problems. As I've said, the scriptures use appealing and imaginative literary forms to bring out a message about the events of salvation history. But modern people wonder what happened really behind those forms. An important part of positive theology is to identify behind the literary forms that have been used and the message they bring the actual historical events. That won't rob us of our faith. It'll only confirm our faith that the Holy Spirit is there guiding people to understand the deep significance of the things that happened in the past. Positive theology moves on from what we've been talking about, the scriptural interpretation, to interpreting the faith of the church down through the ages. A very important field here is patrology, studying the thought of the fathers of the church. The early centuries like a springtime, full of vitality and enthusiasm and inspiration. And the writings of the fathers are filled with resources that can enrich our theology. So there's a big return to that period, an appreciation of the rich vision the fathers had, and the way in which that can help us to enrich our own vision of faith. In this historical awareness of recent times, a new discipline has emerged, what we call history of dogmas, the development of doctrines. How doctrines, though one and the same, have had different forms of expression down through the ages. That's very important because, again, history helps us to understand that it is the one faith, but in different contexts people express that faith differently. With regard to the biblical literature, it's very important to recognise that the Second Vatican Council has affirmed all these methods of criticism. And there's a very important document put out by the Pontifical Biblical Commission, the interpretation of the Bible in the Church, which situates all these methods within the living faith of the Church and helps people to come to terms with those methods and appreciate the ongoing message of the Scriptures. Let's now discuss systematic theology. And in doing this, I'll give you a sort of a survey of our theological tradition in the Western Church. So it's very important for theologians to recognise there are two great traditions in God's Church. Tragically, since the year 1000, they have not been in full communion. But for 1,000 years they shared one faith. And it's important for us in the West to recognise that the great dogmas of our faith were clarified in the Eastern Church. The Western Church was small beer compared with the Eastern Church at that stage. The emperor had moved the capital of the empire from Rome to Constantinople, and they were there the whole centre of cultural and civil life to be found. And within that environment, the great councils of the church that clarified the incarnation and the Trinity took place. And the great writers of the church were predominantly people of the Eastern Church. In the Western Church, we have a spirit of the Roman genius. The Romans were engineers, they were practical people, they were pragmatic people, whereas the Eastern people were philosophers and artists, and their culture was far richer than that of the Latin Church. In that Latin Church, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, the centres moved to the east, and now the empire withered, and barbarians began to invade the empire. The Western Church passed through a difficult period of centuries of chaos. Against all human expectation, the Church triumphed. And those barbarians were converted, and that gave us our Western civilization. But the spirit of faith in the Western Church was very pragmatic, very practical, to do with church unity and division of the church and discipline and those sort of things. For many centuries, the figure who dominated the Western Church and left his mark on a whole Western theology was St. Augustine. He was born the 4th century, died in the 5th century. He dies as the Vandal barbarians were at the gates of his city in North Africa and about to invade it and sack it. Now, Augustine was a genius, an inspired teacher who gathered together the Christian message in a way that enriched the Western Church in the bleak centuries that lay ahead of them, and influenced the thought and the ideals of the Western Church. Augustine was influenced by Plato. The philosophy of Plato was the current philosophy in the world at that time. Plato was a genius of Greek thought. He was a synthetic thinker. His vision of reality was hierarchical, from matter right through to the divine in various stages of development. And he made a synthesis of thought. One of his great works was The Republic, describing the organic nature of human society. Augustine's great work was The City of God, describing the world created by Christian faith in contrast with the world created by the ideals of paganism. So there's a great similarity between their ways of thinking. Then at the end of the Dark Ages, that chaotic period, in the 11th and 12th centuries, there was a renaissance of culture. Think of the medieval cathedrals built in the 12th and 13th centuries. Think of the universities of Europe, were all founded at that time. So it was a new flowering of culture, a new triumph of order in society, and a flowering of the culture that came from that order. At this same time, the Islamic influence was diminishing. Islam had dominated, until the 10th century, Islam had dominated the Mediterranean basin. They were already in Spain, they were coming in through the Balkans, whole of North Africa was under Islamic rule, and Islamic scholars had gathered together the literature of the Greeks. And a most remarkable thing happened in the 11th century and 12th century. In Spain, where the Christians had recaptured most of the country, there were still many Islamic scholars, and there was a wonderful collaboration between Islamic scholars who had the resources of the ancient Greeks, Jewish scholars, and Christian scholars. In Toledo, the bishop had a special centre where those people collaborated and worked together and made translations, shared what they had. This brought to the Western Church a knowledge of Aristotle. So now we have the two great figures of Greek thought are now actively present in Western thought. Augustine is a follower of Plato. Aristotle's thought now has come to the Westerners, and they're fascinated by the order and discipline of Aristotle's thought. There's a famous fresco in the Vatican made by Raphael, which has got all the ancient Greek thinkers and scientists and mathematicians. And in the centre are Plato and Aristotle. Plato is pointing up to the divine order that reason recognises in the world. Aristotle's pointing down to the things of the world. That expresses a contrast between their thought. See, the Greeks had found reason. We take reason for granted. We shouldn't take it for granted. It was a tremendous discovery of the Greeks. Human reason finds unchanging truths. You just can't change them. I'll give you a simple example. The square on the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides of a right-angled triangle. We all learned that at school. No matter what shape that right-angled triangle is, you can prove that the square on the hypotenuse, the longest side, is equal to the squares of the other two sides. Now that's reason, discovering order. So the Greeks found reason, were fascinated by it, dazzled by it. So Plato said, well, this order must be divine. It must be filtering down somehow to us through all the shadows of this world and all the materials changing things. Somehow the shadows and the types and the ideas of God are coming down and available to us, and we discover them by our investigations. Aristotle said, no, I don't agree with that. Look at the world. Use your reason and understand and interpret the world. You'll find that order is impressed in the world. It's part of the world. It governs the world. In medieval thought, with the founding of the universities, there's a great flowering of scholarship and quite a debate between those two points of view. Augustine had been the authority for centuries, and now Aquinas is introduced, especially by Dominican scholars. For a while there was quite a conflict between those views. In the end, Aquinas showed they can be brought together. There's truth in Plato's view, and somehow the world reflects the divine order, but there's truth in Aristotle's view, and that divine order is to be found in itself in the world. So Aquinas established a new theology. The scholastics of the Middle Ages, using reason, clarified many of the questions of the dogmatic debates of the early church, gave them new clarity by defining exactly what is involved. I'm a follower of Aquinas. The church has recognized Aquinas and given him an authority that is without compare in Christian thought. His is a tremendous achievement. Some students take up his Summa of theology and are a bit put off because it's very scholastic. It's not a textbook for learning theology from. It's a book that raises all the questions that can be asked about theology and gives the answers. Aquinas didn't use it as a textbook. Aquinas spoke from the scriptures. The scriptures were his text. And as he explained the scriptures and the mysteries of God, he then referred people to the answers that they find in his Summa. The Middle Ages ended in the 15th century. And at that time scholasticism was very common. let's jump forward to the modern period. In the 16th century, the Reformation was a terrible crisis in the life of the Church. It really stifled theological development. The Catholics were challenged by Protestants about basic things, and the Protestants were carrying on a campaign to prove that the Catholic Church was wrong. They were polarised in a way that narrowed down their theological focus. Very defensive, very confronting. So Catholic theology suffered greatly. The Council of Trent defended the Catholic tradition, and theologians then turned to the Council of Trent, and interpreting the Council of Trent, they gave an answer to all the Protestant difficulties. But it was a narrow sort of answer. We called it neo-scholasticism. It wasn't great like the scholastic work of the Middle Ages, which was rich and varied and open and inquiring. It was a defensive sort of scholasticism and very narrow. And that dominated Catholic thought down to the 20th century. During this period, the recovery of the patristic thought was taking place. At the end of the 19th century, Leo XIII encouraged a revival of Catholic scholarship. Theology was pretty poor and pretty threadbare, so he encouraged a return to St. Thomas. The Pope of later time laid down in canon law that St. Thomas should be the text used in theological education of the clergy. That was probably too narrow. And there was something of a reaction in the 20th century as people who are getting in touch with patristic thought are open to other traditions of philosophy, and Vatican II opened the way to using other methods of theology than that of St. Thomas. Unfortunately, that led to a sort of a turn away from St. Thomas. But today, we now recognise that Thomas, in the end, made a synthesis of Aristotle and Plato that rose above the limitation of both, and he has something tremendous to give to the Church today. And much work is being done interpreting the thought of St. Thomas and rehabilitating him. But in the meantime, great advances have been made by a return to the sources. This movement of going back to the scriptures, for example. The Council of Trent, both the Council of Trent did a great work safeguarding our Catholic tradition, giving us confidence in maintaining that tradition, but we've got to go back to the real sources of the Church's life, the scriptures, the thought of the fathers. People like Henri de Lubac have made a magnificent contribution to Catholic thought. I'll just mention some of the theologians that stand out for me and helped me. Three of them describe themselves as followers of St. Thomas Aquinas. Karl Rahner, a dominant figure in 20th century theology. Karl Rahner looked at the mystery of God, which is the theology interprets, and he relates that to the yearnings of our contemporary world. The desire for spiritual nourishment, a spiritual vision and understanding. So he made a great synthesis that helps people to relate to the modern world and relate those concerns to the essential message of Christian faith. Bernard Lonergan has done great work in theological method. He shows that theological method is not something esoteric and strange and different from other methods. It really follows the processes any mature human being makes in, first of all, finding the truth, progressing towards the truth, and making decisions that shape one's life in accordance with the truth. So Lonergan uses the principles of Aquinas in order to clarify this methodology. Hans Urs von Balthasar has been described as perhaps the most cultivated man of the 20th century, a man of immense culture and erudition, immense scholarship and knowledge of languages and cultures. His great writings have looked at the whole work of God in the mystery of salvation, Christ's work among us, from an aesthetic point of view, the beauty of it, and from a dramatic point of view, the drama of it. So he commends the great mystery as filled with inspiration because of its beauty and its drama, and analyses the whole process of God's revelation in terms of beauty and drama. In modern theology, I should mention, other forms of philosophy than that of Aquinas have been used. Phenomenology is an inquiry, intellectual inquiry that describes in detail experiences and tries to lead people to the truth, not by arguing pros and cons, but by holding up the truth in a description of what people experience, what happens. One form of phenomenology that's very important and influential is personalism. See, Aquinas said the person is the most perfect thing in the whole of reality. But he never explored what it feels like to be a person, the great rich dimensions of being a person, the dimension of trust, of interpersonal encounter, of finding oneself in the relationship with another, the commitments that shape the human person. John Paul II used this approach very, very, very much in his writings and his own thought. He was a follower of Aquinas, so modern philosophies can enrich our understanding of theology. But you see how systematic theology is a vast field, rich. It reflects the personalities of the people who formed those theologies. In my book, Christian Mystery in the Secular Age, I've given quite a long section to the way in which theologies have been formed, how they have an organising principle. It might be the incarnation, it might be the cross and resurrection, the paschal mystery, it might be the church, it might be grace, it might be sacrament. See, so rich is the working of God, so many aspects can be investigated that people can have different perspectives, and then they use different resources to investigate the inquiry. So I refer you to that book if you want to look more into the formation of systematic theology. In this concluding section, we'll consider pastoral theology. How is the faith to be handed on? When you're communicating with someone, you need to know the person you're communicating with, how they think, how they feel, what their attitudes are. So very important for pastoral theology is understanding the human condition. And in modern times, tremendous advances have been made in understanding our human condition. Psychological advances, sociological advances, advances in art, films, novels, literature, poetry. The human condition is now far better understood than any previous period. And so pastoral theology has to relate to those resources, those insights, and find a way to communicate with contemporary people, to hand on the faith. We're called to be bearers of the faith, communicators of the faith, and pastoral theology takes up that challenge. A very important insight for me I found in Cheynou, a French Dominican writer who had a big influence of Vatican II, and one of the writers of the Constitution of the Church in the Modern World. The opening passage, so inspiring, were from his pen. Cheynou says it's very important for us Christians to recognise the difference between faith and religion. Now, many people don't distinguish them. We talk about religious education, don't we? We don't say faith education. Now, Chanu said these two human responses, human experiences, are very different. And it's important to recognize the difference. He said, religion is widespread in the human family. We don't have a monopoly on religion. Many of the other great cultures are filled with religious practices and attitudes. Chanu says, the dynamism of religion is from the creature to God. Worship, cult, ritual, sacrifice, all these things are an attempt by the human race to do honour to God and to relate to God by their self-expression. The Christian faith that we interpret in our theology, and we reflect on what we've said, it's very clear, has a completely opposite dynamism. It begins from God's initiative. God has intervened. God has revealed. God has given the awareness of faith. It's God who's calling his people forward. And if we don't make that distinction, well, and religion can swamp faith. All our practices have become so important that we miss the point of what they're about. So I think that's a very important issue for us in our pastoral work as teachers, as pastors, guides, to recognise the difference between the two. And to recognise, while religion's not bad, like in some cases those who recognise this will act against religion. Christ didn't want any religion. That's nonsense. Christ was a faithful Jew. He does not destroy religion or do away with religion, but he brought the fullness of faith. Even for the Jewish people, faith was more important than religion. The prophets, time and again, said, your sacrifices are empty if there's no real relation to God. So that's a very important distinction to make. And I've given you a reference in my Christian Message in the Secular Age to that explanation of it from Chanu. So pastoral theology uses all the insights that will help us to understand the human condition. The human condition of cultures that have to evangelize, missiology. The whole work of discussing how we bring to the great cultures of the world that have really not known anything except a Western style of Christianity, our way of expressing our great Christian faith. There must be a wonderful discovery to be found when we relate the Christian faith in all its purity and power to their cultures and their needs and their outlooks. That's the work of missiology. Then we have catechetics and evangelization. Here's a whole field, a very challenging field for us as we realize how many of our people are falling away from the practice of faith, partly because religion dominated and faith wasn't inculcated effectively. Then there are psychological resources. In the pastoral care of individuals, it's important to have insight into human nature and how human nature responds to difficulties, the needs of human nature, how to reconcile human nature, how to heal human nature, how to affirm human nature, how to relate human nature to the ongoing gift of God in faith and our Christian religion. Well, this has been a long coverage, this section. I want to bring up for you, as clear as I could in the limited time I had, how rich the field of theology is. You'll find your interest in one or the other of these fields, in one or the other of the great authors that write in theology. There's a tremendous field to be explored there. But remember what I said in the beginning. Take to this study the enthusiasm, the wonder that you have derived from knowing the mystery of revelation and God's great initiative on our behalf.